Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Adventure in the Stars podcast. How my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And as always, hit the subscribe button, everybody. An amazing show for you because board the mothership is Jeff Zanelotti. He's the creator of Accidental Renegades, which is live on Kickstarter. Now come join me as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Zanelotti. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
So my pleasure, sure. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah.
So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who are your earliest influences?
Well, it's tough, I think, to pinpoint exactly what inspired my love of comics. I remember getting some comic books when I was a little kid and I was sick. My father brought home some comics. I guess on his way home from work, he probably stopped at like a train station back when you get the comic books at newsstands. And that kind of ignited, I think, or at least started my love of comics. And that has kind of been there for a long time. But if there are a couple comics that have really stuck with me, it would be some of the Uncanny X-Men stuff from the 80s and 90s, particularly The Mutant Massacre, The Fall of the Mutants, Inferno. Those books and you know, Mark Silvestri's art definitely stuck with me on that. And then probably the one that really made me consider making my own comics would be the Age of Apocalypse series that came out in the 90s as well. And just a complete relook at characters I've grown up with really kind of inspired me that almost anything is possible with this medium.
So I read that you're an educator and a veteran. So how does that background impact who you are and and the kind of stories you tell?
Well, I think it definitely makes me more inquisitive. And I think that's definitely helped me, particularly in creating a comic book where I'm the writer and the artist. Being involved in education has definitely made me realize that there's always a different way to look at a problem and to answer things in different ways. And I think that has probably made my creative side a little bit more well-rounded. I don't necessarily know if, my time in the military, and I spent 20 years in the Army. So, fairly substantial part of my life was in that service. But while I don't necessarily know if it did anything to inspire me creatively, what I do think is it gave me some tools that definitely creative people need, which is time management, staying on schedule, having the discipline to work, even when you don't want to work. I know a lot of people struggle with that. And probably the other thing it kind of did with me is gave me a very strong compass for right and wrong. And one thing thematically that I tend to come back to in both the book I'm doing now and my previous book is, that people who have the power and have the authority need to handle it right. And if not, then it needs to be up to some people to kind of take over and fix that problem. So the idea of, power is a privilege, not a right. And that, needs to be used properly is something that thematically I tend to come back to time and again in my work.
Yeah, I really like that answer. I think the biggest hang up for most creative people is that procrastination aspect where, it's always feels like you love writing to some extent, but you always love writing after it's done and you never want to start it. It's like trying to do your exercise one day. It's like, I'll do it tomorrow. I'm tired.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because in school, I assign an essay to the students and I tell them, okay, this essay is due in 3 months, but don't start it the night before it's due. And very many of them do. And they're very open about it. They're like, nah, I just started this last night. And in my constant just haranguing and badgering on them about managing their time, it pretty much reminded me that I should take my own advice. And so when I was working on my first book, I had a very strict schedule that I tried to at least adhere to the best of my ability. And I found that it helped. I think crowdfunding is kind of a unique animal because sometimes your windows are so wide that if you don't have good time management, it actually makes it harder. Like a lot of people will think, oh, I have 90 days to complete this project. That's plenty of time. I'm good. But in reality, if you had 30 days, you probably would have worked on it harder because your window is shorter. And I think a lot of people in crowdfunding tend to overlook that aspect of it doesn't matter how much time you have. If you're not good at managing that amount of time, that window can be 3 years and you're still not going to hit it.
I agree 100%. I will say in high school, in college I was different. In high school, I'll wager I didn't get anything done until the night before. I remember every day, every assignment being like, I'll start it early. That's way I don't get stressed out the night before. And then the night before, I'm like, okay, let's get this going. It's time.
Yeah. No, I was a fan of the saying in college that if you wait till the last minute to do something, then it only takes a minute to do. And That is not the way to be successful, especially as a creative person, where the work takes time, right? And the better the work, the longer it's going to take. That's a fairly simple calculus. Most people don't do better work in less time. Generally speaking, the more time you have to go back and look at your work, the better the end product tends to be. So giving yourself a little bit more time and managing it wisely is definitely better for the reader, who is your end goal.
So as someone who, like, as a teacher, one of the things, and I guess are you an English teacher, history teacher?
I teach in the social studies electives.
Okay. So one key obviously is in any kind of type of writing is obviously the ability to edit, to evaluate, analyze. So when you're looking at yours, how easy is it for you to step back and look at yours objectively? And are you able to do it immediately, or are you able to, or does it take, a few days away from the work to go back and try to look at it with fresher eyes?
Well, actually, that's a great question. And the answer is probably both, right? Because on the one hand, I do as an individual tend to be very critical of my own work, which I think leads to just the constant self-editing and the cleaning things up and the streamlining. I'm also very interested in constantly learning. And the more I'll learn a new procedure or a new way to make the story better, I will kind of impart into the work. But I also, have to, because I'm the sole person on the book. I'm the writer, I'm the artist, I'm the editor. I do those things. I need to be able to make sure I step back from time to time and give the work a far enough look that I don't miss things because I'm so focused on the details. In my first book, I kind of stumbled a little bit on that, and I ended up not catching a mistake till after it went to print. And it wasn't a substantial mistake, and it certainly didn't mess up the story, but I knew it was there. And because of that, I don't just double check at this point, like I triple and quadruple check, and I have other people like beta readers look at it, because if you're going to put that much time into something, making a stupid mistake is almost unforgivable, especially with all the ways that you can avoid that at this point. So it's kind of a difficult question to answer because I don't have a collaborator, so I don't have someone to bounce those ideas off of, at least formally. But I do have people that I can bounce the ideas of. And another thing is, working, in a high school, is it allows me to kind of, talk to adolescents and teenagers and ask them questions. If this makes any sense, and would you go with that? And being able to kind of crowdsource a lot of ideas from all different types of people is, pretty important to be able to do.
Now, you might also be a little bit like me as a writer. We're talking about going back, being objective, editing, but sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, you find yourself constantly in a state of criticizing your own stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a certain point with me, I find that I'll look at it, look at it once, maybe 23 times. But at a certain point, I need to just stop doing that as well and just go, it is. It is ready now. I need to stop now going back and criticizing what you're doing. Is there a point where you can over edit yourself to some
Absolutely.
extent?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And one thing that is good about staying on schedule is you put yourself in a position where that is a finite process. So you just can't edit yourself forever when you have a deadline. Now, I'm crowdfunding this book right now, but the previous book I did was self-published. I wanted to get out in time for Free Comic Book Day in 2021. Well, that's a date on a calendar. Like, if my book's not ready, they're not going to hold Free Comic Book Day. So I had to get it out by a certain day. And I kind of used a very detailed planning process to be able to get that done, to get it to the printer and account for the variables that I couldn't control. What that meant was, if it needed to get out to the printer by, let's just say, August 10th, right? It needed to get out to the printer by August 10th. Whatever the book looked like on August 10th, that was it. That was as good as the book was going to get. So there were a couple pages that when I open it up and I look at it now, I really wish I'd had a little bit more time on. But at the same time, I was able to produce about a 20-page one-shot completely on my own, on time, and still get it back in time to be able to get into the stores. I mean, for a first-time creator at that moment, that's not too shabby. I would love more time, but having a schedule means that you eventually are going to run out, and you just have to prioritize the work.
How comfortable are you going back and reading your published work?
I'm not really a huge fan, to be honest with you. I'm not really. And I think that's not abnormal. And that's not to say that the work is bad, but I'm so closely, intimately tied to it that I can almost remember, like, what day I did that panel and what I was going through, what I was struggling with, why I didn't, how, trying to get the angle right, trying to figure out the camera shot, for lack of a better word. And then there's a couple pages that I look at and I'm like, wow, that page really came out great. Like, I'm really, really happy with that. So, when you're on social media and people are like, hey, post your favorite picture. I'm like, well, I know exactly which one it's not going to be, and I know exactly which one it should be. So it's very easy to be critical, but I I don't really look at it too much unless it's to try to figure out how to do things a little bit better from either a technical perspective or a artistic perspective. And there have been a lot of lessons that I've learned in that, but I certainly don't dwell on it. I have a copy in a box, and I still kind of cringe a little bit when I open it, so I don't open it very often. But I think that's not out of the ordinary. You talk to anyone, I think they'll tell you pretty much the same thing.
I will totally agree with you. There's very little that I've written that when I go back, I don't it's the wince. You kind of like,
yeah.
Oh, what the hell was I doing on that one? It's like, you kind of wish you could go back and like be like, call the publisher, be like, hey, I know it's been a few years, but can we go back and republish? I think you want to fix some things.
I used to be, like a decade ago, used to be very active on social media, posting jokes and trying to be the funny guy and everything like that. And I kind of grew up and I stopped doing that. Well, now every day on Facebook, I get the memories, and I go back and what I posted 12 or 13 years ago that I thought was the funniest thing. I see it. I'm like, it's not even that it's not funny. It wasn't funny. It was childish. It was dumb. And it's very easy to cringe at things you thought were brilliant when you did it. But with maturity, I guess, comes perspective. And I just didn't have it 12 years ago. So
yeah, that we'll call that growth.
Yeah, exactly. Call it growth. Make it sound positive. Yeah, make it sound great.
So your current book that you have on social media, on Kickstarter, is called Accidental Renegades. So what inspired this creation, and what keeps you returning to this property?
Well, what I love about comics creating is it kind of gives me a way to put my voice out there, right? And what kind of started my whole comics journey was in 2020, when we had the pandemic and everyone initially went on lockdown and no one could really do anything. I had spent a lot of time, more time than I'm happy to admit, arguing with people on social media, getting into fights with closed-minded individuals. And it was pointless and it was useless and it was a waste of energy and it was frustrating and it accomplished nothing. And it took me a little while to realize that a better way to invest my energy was to take that frustration and put it into something creative. So I kind of threw myself back into, the idea of creating a comic book, which was an idea that I'd harbored for many, many years and always made excuses for why it wasn't the right time. And I just dove headfirst into it. And the more I did, the better I got, and the quicker I got, and the more proficient I got. And then I decided to self-publish, and I kind of did that. So the original book that I had was a great story, but it wasn't really one I was happy to tell forever. Now, Accidental Renegades kind of becomes my way of kind of addressing some of the things that bother me as an individual, stuff that I've seen in my military career, stuff that I've seen outside, stuff that I see just turning on the news today. And it's kind of a way, almost allegorically, to be able to address some of these issues, but through the lens of a manga-inspired comic book that most people can relate to. And the other thing I'll say is I tend to work more comfortably in group books than individual character books, because not only do you get diversity of characters, but you also, with a group book, get much more of a diversity of perspective. And what I think with that is anyone can pick up that book. Now, I pick up Batman and I love it, but I don't relate to Batman. Batman, with sense of maybe some of his perspectives, I don't really relate to Batman very much. I don't have that much in common. But in a group book, I can pick it up and I can relate to one of the characters or a couple of the characters just based on their varying perspectives, their varying personalities. So what I like about group books is, from an artistic perspective, it's fun, but from a writer perspective, it's a way to kind of express things and have built-in friction, not just towards the plot, but also towards each other, which just makes it more interesting. So I do enjoy characters that are in team books, and that's where I tend to lean.
So as the writer and the artist, are you still writing script form first, or do you dive right into art?
No, it's actually, because it's all me, I'm able to use a very disjointed shorthand sort of format. And what works for me is it goes like this. I figure out what's going to happen on each page. So each page basically just has a blurb on top that says, on this page, Superman flies into the building and he sees, Lois is in danger. That's it. And then the next page, it talks about, so each page just has an overarching thing that happens on each page. That allows me to figure out the beats, figure out where the major page turns are going to be, make sure they're on the right number of pages so that it happens when the readers physically turn the page, as opposed to having an open page. It allows me to figure out double page spreads, that sort of thing. So I can map that out very much, writ large in the macro, what everything's going to happen. Then I can start to go through and get in detail about what's happening now on each page. And when I do that, that's when I start to transition between writing and artist. I figure out some panels. I figure out which one's going to be, a splash page, which one is going to have a lot of panels, small panels, whatever. I start to kind of work on that. Now, this is where it almost kind of becomes a loop, because I'll keep coming back over and over to this phase. Even now, I'm really grinding out the book, but even yesterday, I decided to adjust the way the panels on a page were set up, because I felt like it lent itself to the story better. So I do start with writing, and I kind of go back and forth as I go through it, because again, it's all me. So I can leave myself little notes and shorthand and clues that only I may know, hey, make this look like that panel from that, Joe Madureira Uncanny X-Men that I like, when he drew Magneto in that page. Well, I know exactly what that picture is. No one else needs to, because I do, and I can kind of go back and use my own, code words basically. And it makes it a little bit quicker and easier, but it's a constant process of revising and refining that isn't really done until the last page is complete.
Now, according to your pitch, your protagonists are mercenaries who accidentally start a global revolution. Once started, do they believe in the cause, or do they just feel responsible for the role in causing it?
Well, that's kind of how they evolve throughout the story. And it really does kind of, I think, flip the traditional superhero trope a little bit on its side, is that in most, Western comics, even in a lot of, shonen style manga, the hero's goal is to become a hero. Their goal is either to be the best hero, or to be the king of the heroes, or, to be on the Avengers, or what have you. With these individuals, their goal is actually not that. They want to be left alone. They have power that they never asked for. They didn't seek it out. It was kind of foisted upon them. And now they're forced to serve as the roles of figureheads for some sort of change, and they never wanted it. So over time, you'll see, do they eventually start to embrace their roles as folk heroes, or do they end up paying for the consequences of their actions? And because it's a team book, not everyone is necessarily going to go in the same direction. They're not necessarily all going to get there at the same time. So it does create a little bit of internal drama based on the fact that everyone has the same, problem, but they're going to approach it differently.
So ideally, for your protagonist, what is the ideal outcome for this revolution in their eyes?
Well, I think that for them, ideally, they want to get it complete and be left alone as quickly as possible. So their goal is to basically solve the problem as effectively and efficiently as possible. They don't want the notoriety. They want to solve that issue. So, the leader of the team makes it very clear that their goal is to be left alone. And through the confluence of events, that goal basically becomes unattainable for him. And then how does he react to the level of responsibility that he has under such a serious condition, trying to do something that he's made very clear from the start he does not want?
Can the characters stay who they are and do what they do within the confines of being part of this revolution, especially if it proves successful?
I think so, but I think if you look at anyone when they go through some sort of trial, the parts of them stay the same, but there's parts of them that are invariably going to change. And part of what makes this story interesting, I think, is that you get to watch these characters grow as the tension on them gets ratcheted up. And again, some of them will respond in ways that are encouraging. Some of them may respond in ways that are not. I mean, we have imperfect characters. One thing I try to write characters that are flawed. And not every flawed character, rises to the occasion. If they did that, that wouldn't necessarily be interesting.
So it's kind of interesting. So success to them is different than what you would consider success probably in a standard storyline. I mean, is success simply just not having to deal with the situation anymore? Is success truly a revolution? Is there some optimism towards what's happening for them?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it like from almost like an individual perspective, when you're given a task to do or a responsibility that you don't want, and oftentimes your goal is to return to the status quo. Your goal is to get that task done to the point that people will leave you alone, and then you can kind of return to where you're at. But just through that journey, people tend to change. And, I know from my own military background, seeing people that didn't want to be in charge suddenly had the responsibility of leadership on them and rose to that occasion. And at the end of it, they came out on the other side different. Some of these characters will do that. Some of these characters will realize the important role that they can play, and they will grow into that role. And some of them may not. And that's interesting because, again, that's real.
Now you're saying, as far as the plot that I've read a little bit synopsis of it, they are leading this revolution. So for those who they are now leading, are they showing a front to them of being on their side, of wanting this revolution, of being a side of it, or is it clear to even those who are following them they're not all in or not intentionally all in?
Well, what's interesting with that particular question, and I'm kind of glad you brought that up because this is something I never really get a chance to talk about, is one of the things that kind of gets examined throughout the course of not just the first issue, but the first volume. It's scheduled out to go several issues. Is that the first volume talks about the role that the media plays in our perception of events, and there's going to be an inciting event in the first issue that is viewed differently depending on who's reporting it and who's kind of explaining it. So one side may see it as heroic, another side may see it as cowardly. But what it really does is it kind of turns around and looks at the fact that what we're told often impacts what we think, not necessarily what we think impacting what we do. So it does give an interesting bit of a wrinkle in that the reporting actually ends up affecting the way the characters view the group.
So you have a lot of interesting characters on this team. I may get the name pronouncing it wrong. Kali, am I correct on it?
Yes, Kali.
Yes. Kali,
Yeah.
Who's a very interesting character. Is if I'm remembering checking it correctly, she's a Hindu ninja vampire. Am I correct on this one?
Yes, basically she's a yeah, I guess, that's what I call her. It might be an oversimplification. I'm certainly not trying to be culturally insensitive, but she's one of the diverse groups. So she is Indian. And she also, is the most talented fighter of the group, but she's also kind of harboring a dark secret. And that through the whole story, while she's trying to grow as an individual, she's also trying to kind of fight the demon that's inside her.
So how does one handle those three very distinct aspects? Once again, the vampire, the Hindu, the religion, and the ninja aspect. How does she come to terms with the Hindu aspect of her and this darker vampire part?
Well, and that's, I think, the interesting dichotomy with her is that she basically, it's not so much that she fights, because she does fight. I mean, she fights as part of her more or less her cause. That's part of her personality, is to fight. But I think she's able to rationalize it because of the reason that she fights. She's not necessarily the kind of person who's just going to go and start a bar brawl. But if people or something she cares about is threatened, then she's going to respond in a way to handle that threat pretty directly. So, like a lot of people, I think you don't like to be pushed, but once pushed past a certain point,
right,
your personality kind of shifts. For her, that is kind of her rationale for fighting. She's just not going to go, hey, let's go fight somebody. But if she is backed into a corner where someone she cares about is threatened, then she will respond probably with a level of viciousness that is a little bit more than necessary, but that's a character flaw that she works through.
Now, from a perspective of faith, for someone who sounds like is someone who does have faith or adheres to a faith, the idea of being a vampire, once again, it always goes with the concept of damnation. Is that something that she also comes to terms with? Someone who has this faith, but now is part of something or has become something that can never probably achieve wherever the end game is for a faithful person.
Yeah, and that's really, you kind of touched exactly on what her individual arc is rationalizing, her sense of morality versus this, addiction that she has that she needs to control, even though she could probably never be over it.
So Accidental Renegades it's kicking his ass on Kickstarter. Last I looked, it's at 150% of its goal, which is congratulations on that one.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
So I always like to, when I talk to people who have already are beating their goal and doing well, what is the key to now creating a great Kickstarter? Because apparently,
Well, I will tell you, this Kickstarter, fortunately it funded in 11 days, which was pretty cool. I know that's, I've seen Kickstarters that fund in 48 minutes. I got 11 days, but for my first Kickstarter, I think that's pretty solid. I'm also, in a weird way, I'm kind of proud of the fact that I'm not on the Kickstarter landing page. I'm not a project we love. It's my first project. It's growing. The backers are getting added slowly. It's not, 100 a day. It's, a slow incremental growth. So while I don't have those accolades, at the same time, I almost kind of think that's a badge of honor, because I was able to fund this Kickstarter without all those additional, accolades, and hopefully on the next one we'll get them, but we didn't this time. I think the key to success really is not really, you have to do your homework. Clearly, you have to put together a Kickstarter that is strong enough and people want to follow it. So the product is really, I think, what sells itself. having a good pitch, having, some interesting pages, that's important too. But I really think if you have something that is strong enough to stand on its own, it's going to stand on its own. I definitely leaned on the social media, but one thing that I learned from this process is the importance of having your tribe, for lack of a better word. And one thing I will never stop saying about the independent comics community is that they come through, they work together, and for a group of people that are all aiming for the same goal, the amount that everyone is willing to support one another is really impressive. It's unlike anything I've really ever seen, where people who might be considered in a small pond to be your competitors are actively helping you succeed. And so that's been awesome. I would tell anyone who's trying to build a Kickstarter, build your tribe first. Surround yourself with good, hardworking, creative people, and those people will help get you across that finish line. I've already seen it in a relatively short time happen several times, where Kickstarters that were really struggling to hit their goal, the last day got a surge. One, because they were good products that should be backed, but also because the community really came out in force, and a bunch of other creators, many of whom had Kickstarters going at the same time, were like, hey, I want you to back my book, but my book's going for another week or two. What I want you to do today is go back this book. And it's, where else can you say that you'll see people who will literally tell you not to buy their thing so you can buy someone else's thing, hoping that you'll buy their thing later. It sounds so crazy to say it out loud, but it's pretty much just every day in this community. So before you build your brand, or at least at the same time, you have to build your community. If you don't do that, you're, I think, really going to struggle to succeed.
I really like the idea that the community does come out to help you. And it does take a lot of forethought. You can't just jump in. Takes preparing time. It looks sort of like Batman. Prep time. You got to put together your prep time.
With enough prep time, you can do anything with a Kickstarter. Sure, yeah.
So do you have a favorite reward that you have on your Kickstarter, and which one are you most excited to start shipping?
Okay, so this is actually a funny story, because because of my first Kickstarter, I didn't want to have 15 different tiers. It's just too much, I think, as a first time creator to manage. But one of the tiers that I came up with was called the Commercial Renegade. The Commercial Renegade for the book Accidental Renegades had a digital copy, a physical copy, a hand-drawn sketch, and what really set that tier apart was that you were able to put yourself or your logo. I would draw it into the book. And that was a $50 tier. So I kind of figured it wouldn't, probably a couple of people would take advantage of, but I didn't think it would be that popular. It was the tier that on that tier alone, I almost funded the entire book. It was just, about 27 people, which works out to, I think, about $1,400 without doing the math in my head. So that book, the campaign almost funded entirely on that tier. And I very much, I think, underestimated how popular it would be. And what I ended up having to do was, close that tier on the 1st of August, because in a book about, an alien planet, I was like, there's going to be an awful lot of middle-aged white guys drawn into this book at this rate. And while that's awesome, it really is not the story I'm supposed to be telling. So
right.
I was concerned. I'm like, man, my best friend growing up, his mom bought that tier. So it's she's going to be in the book. But that's not necessarily the best thing for the story. So I had to kind of put a pin on it, and it kind of hurt to close out your highest money-making tier. But now when I get to issue 2 and I launch that, I'll know to do things a little bit differently and maybe have that tier set up a little bit differently. So I think I was surprised by how quickly and how many people took advantage of the most expensive tier. I thought it would be cost prohibitive. And I think in talking to other people, they said, well, $50, I mean, it is a lot of money. But $50 to get yourself drawn into a comic book that you can then own, it's a unique thing. So I guess maybe, when people did the cost benefit analysis, they figured it was money well spent. So I hated to have to shut it down, but I had to eventually close that tier because I really started to get concerned. I kind of live by the quote that everything is in service to the story. And if, my attempt to grab $50 more starts to mess up the story, then it's not worth it for anybody.
So what gets everyone the most excited? Do we got stretch goals that we're offering, and what are they?
Yes. So we just hit our first stretch goal. Our first stretch goal was at $2,000, and all physical backers get a fancy foil cover on the book. So more, high quality printing. So a fancy foil cover, better paper, better print quality. So that goes to all the physical backers. Once we hit 2,500, then we incorporate stickers. And I'd have to go back and look, but if I remember correctly, at $3,000, it becomes trading cards. I've seen a couple people who do trading cards with their books. I saw one at a local convention did trading cards, and they were awesome. Their book was almost kind of more of like a slice of life type story. and the trading cards still work. So I can only imagine trading cards for superpower characters where you could put their, their power stats, a little bio of them on the back. Kind of takes me back to my childhood. I'm looking forward to potentially hitting that goal. Not just because it's more funding, but because I really do think it would be exciting to be able to have some trading cards for these characters. I think that'd be really, really cool. So we hit stretch goal number 1. We're breathing down the neck of stretch goal number 2, and then from there we'll aim at stretch goal number 3.
Oh, very cool. So how long does this campaign run?
This campaign ends officially on September 13th.
Very cool.
But really, it's the morning of, so it really ends on the late night of September 12th or very early September 13th.
So for our listeners, get on the ball, find the link on our YouTube notes for the Kickstarter, and spend some money, get yourself a good comic book.
Yeah, it'll be great. I think you'll love it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Zanelotti. You're awesome to talk to, and wish you continued luck on Accidental Renegades.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you, too.